Chapter 6. It shouldn't be this frigging difficult to start a lawnmower, Jan cursed. Taking hold of the starter cord again, she summoned all her strength and gave it a sharp pull. The engine turned once, the cord sprang back into place, and then nothing. Bloody hell! Her right arm was aching from repeatedly pulling the starter cord, and now there was a strong smell of petrol. She'd probably flooded the engine, she thought, with all the attempts she'd been making to get it going. An electric lawnmower, like her parents had, would have been much easier. You just plugged it in and off you went. Chris had said Camille's mower could be temperamental in damp weather, but the weather wasn't damp. The day had stayed fine, which was why Jan had decided to cut the grass after she'd returned from the village store. She pulled the cord again, and the smell of petrol grew stronger. If she had flooded the engine, the only solution was to leave it to dry out. Then, if it still wouldn't start, she'd have to phone Chris, which might not be such a bad idea anyway. She may as well put the time to good use while she waited, she decided. Taking the rake from the shed, she began raking up fallen leaves. Tinder was indoors, as he was scared of the lawnmower. Once she had a decent-sized pile of leaves, she scooped them up and dumped them on the compost heap, which was at the bottom of the garden to the left of the shed. The garden had a large central lawn, flanked by borders of shrubs, so there wasn't much to do at this time of year. Camille had written in her notes that if Jan could cut the grass and clear up the leaves, that would be great. She didn't think Camille would be impressed with her efforts so far to cut the grass, but then Jan had never had to do it before. She continued raking leaves from the lawn, working her way down one side and then across the bottom. How different it was out here in daylight. Peaceful, idyllic. She felt at one with nature. As she cleared away the leaves from the hedge where the shadow had disappeared the evening before, she saw the gap it had gone through and track marks in the mud. There were a lot of prints merging together that could have belonged to anything, but suggested there might be more than one animal, and that they had been coming into the garden for some time, not just the last 4 nights when Tinder had become spooked. The prints seemed rather large for foxes, but she could be wrong. It crossed Jan's mind that perhaps Camille had been encouraging them in by feeding them, although she was sure she would have included this in her detailed notes. I feed the family of foxes, so would you? Raking away the last of the leaves, Jan dumped them on the compost heap, put away the rake, and returned to the lawnmower. Any excess petrol should have evaporated by now. One last try, and then she'd give up and call Chris, although it was a bit late for him to come today. The sun would be setting soon, so it would be dark by the time he arrived, assuming he was free, of course. Taking hold of the starter handle, Jan focused, took a deep breath and gave the cord a hefty pull, her very best and final effort. The cord snapped back into place as the engine fired and then amazingly spluttered into life. Success. The engine was running, but raggedly, as though it could cut out at any moment. Moving the lever on the handle, Jan increased the revs until it was running more smoothly, then releasing the handbrake, she let the mower pull away. The roller was powered, so no pushing was required. She began going up and down the lawn and soon found it quite satisfying. She could see why Camille preferred this type of mower. Once it had started, it mowed the grass by itself. There was no pushing and no long electricity cable to avoid severing. All Jan had to do was steer it up and down and keep the line straight. The result was starting to look rather professional, she thought. She was pleased she'd persisted in getting the mower started without having to call Chris for help. It was another small accomplishment, giving her confidence a much-needed boost. Silly, really, taking pride in cutting the grass, but losing her job and long-term partner in one go had damaged her confidence like nothing else had before. Now she was rebuilding it gradually, bit by bit, slowly adding to her achievements. However, the mower was noisy, she had to admit. It blocked out any other sound. Little wonder Tinder preferred to stay indoors. It was only when she stopped to empty the grass that she heard it. A noise. A rustle coming from the hedge behind her. She turned, but there was nothing to be seen at the bottom of the garden where the sound had come from. She remained where she was, listening and watching. Perhaps it was one of the foxes coming to investigate. In daylight? Chris had said they were hungry at this time of year and approached homes looking for food when they wouldn't normally. Or perhaps the noise of the lawnmower had disturbed them. But wouldn't they be scared off like Tinder? Slightly unsettled, Jan removed the grass box from the back of the lawnmower and emptied it onto the compost heap. As she shook it clear, she heard the noise again. The shed was blocking her view. Moving quietly, she came out from beside it. The garden was empty. She went over and looked at the gap in the hedge where the track marks had been. Were those fresh prints? She couldn't be sure. The air remained quiet and still. The sun would be setting soon. She needed to finish cutting the grass. Silencing her unease, Jan returned to the mower and started it again. The engine fired up easily now it was warm. She continued cutting the grass, up and down, creating neat stripes. But as she worked, she had the strangest feeling she was being watched. It was weird, unsettling, and completely irrational, she told herself. Yet the feeling grew, so that she had to keep taking her eyes from the lawn in front to look behind her. She chided herself for being silly, but eventually the feeling became so strong she stopped the mower and went to the hedge at the bottom of the garden for a closer look. Leaning in, she pulled aside some branches so she could see into the hedge more clearly. Camille's garden was separated from the woods by shrubs forming a hedge. She looked at the hole Tinder and the shadow had gone through. "Hello? Anyone there?" she called, then felt foolish. Did she expect an animal to reply? Unless it wasn't an animal. Perhaps there were scouts camping in the woods or a homeless person living there, she wondered, as she had before. Now she'd cleared the leaves and parted the shrubbery, she could see the gap was big enough for a child to get through, or even an adult if they crouched down and crawled through. Was that what was making those marks? Someone crawling through. Jan pulled aside more branches and saw another cluster of prints, which again could have belonged to anything. Whatever had been here had gone now, as had the feeling of being watched. It could have been her imagination all along. She needed to finish cutting the grass before sunset. The light was failing fast. If she didn't finish cutting it now, she'd have to go through all the palaver of starting the mower from cold again tomorrow. Returning to the mower, Jan started it without a problem and finished cutting the lawn. She emptied the grass box again and then wheeled the mower into the shed where it was stored. As she returned across the now freshly cut grass to the back door of the cottage, she heard a noise again. She spun round. There was nothing to be seen. Whatever was out there was well hidden on the other side of the hedge. With a shiver, she quickly continued indoors. If the sensor light was working, once it was dark it should show her what was coming into the garden and hopefully put her fears to rest. Tinder appeared from the living room, ready for his dinner. Jan fed him and then checked her phone. There was a missed call from her mother. She'd speak to her once she'd made herself a hot drink. The temperature outside had dropped while she'd been cutting the grass, and her fingers were cold. She cupped her hands around the mug of steaming tea and stood at the living room window looking out onto the garden. The sun continued on its descent, and at 6:30 Jan thought it was dark enough to test the sensor light. She opened the back door and stepped out. To her disappointment, the light didn't immediately flash on, but when she took another couple of steps across the patio and moved into its range, light flooded the area. It was working, and it would cover the patio just outside the living room windows. Pleased with herself, Jan returned indoors as Tinder went out for a run. Closing the back door, she picked up her phone and texted Chris. "Hi, success. I got the lawnmower and sensor light working. It was switched off. Just waiting to see who my nocturnal visitors are. Jan. Kiss." Making light of it helped ease her disquiet. 5 minutes later, Chris replied, not congratulating her as she thought he would, but raising some concern. "Camille might have switched it off for a reason, so maybe leave it off." She texted back, feeling she should justify her actions. "I thought it might have accidentally been turned off." His response was, "I think you need to ask Camille before you change anything in her cottage." She felt the censure of his words and was sorry. He was right. Of course she should have checked with Camille first. Chapter 7. "Do you think that policewoman suspects?" Emma anxiously asked Ian. "No," he replied a little wearily, glancing up from his laptop. "She has no reason to." "But supposing she contacts Anne?" "She doesn't know who our midwife is, and anyway, Anne will know what to say." "You'd better warn Anne the police have been here," Emma persisted. "I wouldn't want her getting into trouble. She's helped so much, seeing to everything, even though she shouldn't have." "I've already spoken to her," Ian replied. "What did she say?" "That what we told the officer was right. But if she comes back, it's probably best to pretend we're out so we don't have to answer any more questions." "Comes back?" Emma exclaimed in alarm. "I thought you said she went away satisfied. Why would the police come back?" Ian sighed. "I don't think she will. I'm just telling you what Anne said as you asked." Emma fiddled nervously with the sleeve of her jumper as Ian returned his attention to his laptop. It was evening, and they were in the living room, but she couldn't concentrate on the book she was supposed to be reading. She felt even more wretched now, with the worry of the police visit on top of the trauma of losing the baby. She'd been in bed all day, but Ian had persuaded her to come down for dinner, which he'd made. Now she was regretting it. Sleep gave her some respite from the horror of it all, but when she was awake, it was full on. All she did was sit and remember, right from the start, when she first found out she was pregnant again and the baby was damaged the same as the first one. Day after day, week by week, until the unimaginable horror of giving birth. Thank goodness it hadn't been full term, and thank goodness for Anne, she thought. She wouldn't have managed without her. It had shot out, she remembered grimly, as pleased to be rid of her as she was of it. Her stomach clenched at the recollection. David, they'd decided to call him, which meant loved one. He would have been so loved had nature not played another cruel trick on them. A baby that wasn't viable was the clinical term, but it had only been confirmed when it was too late for a termination. Ian seemed to be doing better than she was, Emma acknowledged, and was able to concentrate on work. But then he hadn't been pregnant, carried it all those months, hoping for the best but fearing the worst. It was easier for him. "I think I'll go back to bed," Emma said and closed her book. "No, don't, please," Ian said imploringly, and standing went to her. "Don't shut yourself away any longer. We need to talk about what's happened and discuss what we're going to do in the future." "I'm not trying for a baby again, if that's what you mean," Emma said sharply, tears springing to her eyes. "You said lightning never strikes twice in the same place, but it did for us, and this time it was worse than the last." Her face crumpled, and she dissolved into tears. Ian put his arm around her and held her as she wept. "I would never put you through that again," he said gently, stroking her hair. "Never. It's too much. I'm hurting too. I love you, but before we give up completely on our dream of starting a family, There's something I want to talk to you about." "What?" she asked, looking at him through her tears. Ian took a tissue from the box and gently wiped her eyes. "I wouldn't want us to try again for a child unless we could be certain it wouldn't happen a third time." "But we can't be certain," Emma cried. "That's the problem. We don't know until it's too late. Anne told us we shouldn't try again because the same thing was likely to happen." "I know, but please hear what I have to say. I've been doing some research on the internet." "Go on then. Tell me." "You remember when we were told about how David would be after the scan?" "Yes, vividly," she said. "It was awful and I was hysterical." "I know. You kept saying over and over again that there must be something wrong with you. I reassured you there wasn't." "I remember. Are you saying now that you've found out that there is something wrong with me after all? So it's my fault?" No, listen, please. It's not your fault, any more than it's mine. But supposing there was something in our genes that's causing the problem. Lots of conditions can be passed down through genes without anyone knowing, and then it suddenly appears. But what happened to us has never happened in my family before, Emma said. Neither in mine, but supposing there is something a long way back we don't know about. Like what? Emma asked. You're scaring me. I don't mean to scare you, love, but if we could find a reason for what's happening, then it would reassure us, and there might be a chance it could be corrected. Medical scientists are doing wonderful things, manipulating DNA so babies can be born healthy without inherited conditions. It was more than a condition, Emma said, grimacing. But how could we find out? I've been researching, and a good place to start would be to look at our family trees. It's pretty easy now online. Then we can apply for death certificates, which will tell us what our relatives died of. I've already started on my family. Let me show you. Emma watched as Ian fetched his laptop and returned to sit next to her on the sofa. She hadn't seen him so enthusiastic about anything in a long while. What made you think of this? She asked him. I watched a program on television a few nights ago about the way information is passed down through our genes. It was fascinating. It said marrying a cousin is often a bad idea because inbreeding can lead to genetic conditions and mutations. It got me thinking about us. I know we're not cousins, but there could be something in our families that has lain dormant for generations and would have continued to do so had we not met and tried to have children. Many inherited conditions are only passed on if both parents are carriers. Cystic fibrosis, for example. Do you see what I'm getting at? Sort of. But if you do find something, do you think the doctors will be able to treat it and stop it from happening again? I think we're in with a chance. It will depend on how far the research has progressed. And even if there's nothing that can be done, at least we'll know for certain and can look at alternatives like adoption or fostering. I suppose you're right, Emma agreed. But as Ian began to show her the research he'd started on his family tree, she felt a surge of fear. There was something in her family, a secret that she'd never shared with Ian. Whether it could have any bearing on what he was trying to uncover, she wasn't sure. But she couldn't say anything to him until she'd spoken to her mother first. Chapter 8. Jan wondered if she should switch off the motion sensor light because Chris had said in his text message Camille might have switched it off for a reason. Perhaps the wiring was unsafe, in which case it could catch fire. But if it was dangerous, surely Camille would have included a warning in her notes. Don't use the light on the patio, it's not working properly, or something similar. There was no smell of burning coming from the switch box in the small bedroom. Jan had checked, and the light outside seemed to be okay too. It had crossed Jan's mind to text Chris back and apologize, but she'd decided against it. Lise said, soonest mended. Instead, she did what she should have done in the first place and messaged Camille. "I've switched on the sensor light on the patio. Hope that's okay." It took Camille nearly half an hour to reply. "It gobbles up electricity, so best keep it off." So that was the reason it was off. It made sense. She would switch it off again once it had served its purpose and illuminated whatever it was that was coming into the garden. Jan had topped up the meter and was now waiting for 8 o'clock, the time when whatever it was had visited the last 4 nights. Animals were creatures of habit, she'd read online. Once she knew what it was and that it wouldn't harm her or Tinder, she could relax. Tinder was feisty but small and wouldn't be able to protect himself if attacked. It was pitch dark outside now. Jan had finished dinner, washed up, and was now sitting on the sofa, the television remote and her phone within reach. Although she was miles away from her family and friends, they were keeping in contact by phone and text. Some of her friends said they were envious of what she was doing, taking time out. An enforced sabbatical, one had called it. Put like that, it sounded as though she had made an informed decision, had had a choice, rather than being made redundant and then dumped by her boyfriend. When Jan had spoken to her mother on the phone earlier, she had delicately asked if she'd had any thoughts about her future. Jan had mumbled something about a possible career change, maybe retraining as a teacher or social worker, but she was looking into it. It was enough to satisfy her mother, although Jan was pretty sure she didn't have what it took to be a teacher or social worker. She wasn't sure where her skills lay or what she wanted to do in the future. Tinder jumped onto her lap and then spent some moments turning in a circle until he was comfortable. Jan absently stroked his head while looking at the gap in the curtains. As soon as the motion sensor light flashed on, she'd pull open the curtains and hopefully get a good look at what was there. It was 7:30 now, half an hour to go. Her pulse stepped up a beat. She picked up the remote control and switched on the television, more as a distraction than to watch anything. With the volume on low, she flicked through the channels. Tinder closed his eyes and began to doze. An old film was running, and Jan glanced between the television and the time on her phone. 8 o'clock gradually approached. A few minutes before 8, Jan turned off the television and listened. Tinder was still asleep. She watched him carefully. He'd probably hear it first. He slept on. 8 o'clock came and went. Jan's sense of expectation and foreboding increased. Where were they? She gently lifted Tinder from her lap and resettled him at the other end of the sofa. He looked at her inquisitively as she knelt on the sofa and then peered through the gap in the curtains into the dark beyond. There was nothing to be seen but the ghostly outline of the trees in the woods. Jan stayed where she was, her breath shallow. She held the edge of the curtain and glanced at Tinder for any sign he'd heard something. 5 minutes passed, and he began dozing again. Perhaps they weren't coming tonight. Perhaps they wouldn't ever come again. Animals changed their dens and burrows. She'd give it another 15 minutes and then switch off the sensor light. It crossed Jan's mind as she waited, looking through the gap in the curtains, that perhaps she'd become a little obsessed with whatever was visiting the garden. Chris clearly hadn't been worried, but she knew she wouldn't sleep easy until she'd seen whatever was out there. She couldn't shift the feeling she'd had in the garden of being watched. It had been intense, and she didn't think it was just her imagination. A few more minutes passed, then Tinder slowly raised his head. His ears pricked up, and his eyes rounded as he began a low, guttural growl. He had heard something, but the motion sensor light hadn't come on. Perhaps whatever it was had just entered the garden and was now making its way over the lawn towards the cottage. Jan clutched the edge of the curtain, ready to pull it open. Tinder was still growling. Suddenly, a noise at the back door made her jump. Tinder leapt off the sofa and ran to the door, barking. But the light outside still hadn't come on, so whatever it was must have avoided the sensor and gone straight to the back door. Jan went after Tinder. He was pawing at the door, desperate to get out. She gingerly opened the back door, aware that any noise would probably cause whatever was outside to run away. The cold night air rushed in, but there was nothing to be seen. As she stared into the darkness, door held ready to close, Tinder ran to the bottom of the garden, barking furiously, then disappeared through the hedge. Drat! The barking stopped. Then Jan heard a yelp of pain come from the woods. A cry that suggested an animal, possibly a dog, had been injured. "Tinder!" she called, praying he would reappear. Nothing. "Tinder!" A lone owl hooted in the distance. Shit! She needed to find him, and fast. Not giving herself time to think, she ran out over the lawn towards the place where he had disappeared. "Tinder!" she shouted. The air was still. "Tinder!" He could be hurt. Suddenly her blood ran cold as she heard a noise come from behind. She spun round, just in time to see a shadowy figure run down the side of the cottage. "Stop!" she shouted, giving chase. Too late. She arrived in time to see it disappear over the gate. Shivering, Jan returned to the back door. "Tinder!" she shouted one last time as she went in. Nothing. Not a sound. Chapter 9. Jan sat on the sofa, wrapped in the duvet from her bed, and sipped a hot toddy. The heating was on, but she couldn't get warm. Even the hot toddy, whiskey, water, lemon and honey, wasn't really helping. Tinder was missing again, and she was really struggling to make sense of what she'd seen. Was there more than one of them? Tinder had chased something through the hedge, and then that something had appeared behind her, close to the cottage. Had it intended to go in? She shivered. It was possible. It must have been hiding in the bushes beside the cottage, watching her as she went down the garden after Tinder. Had it hidden there before? Jan took another sip of her drink and tried to steady her nerves. Were the two of them working together? And what or who were they? The way they'd avoided the sensor light could have been luck or intelligence. Squirrels were renowned for their intelligence when searching for food and could break into quite elaborate squirrel-proof bird feeders. She knew because her parents had problems with squirrels in their garden. But what she had seen wasn't a squirrel, not by a long way. It was much larger and a different shape entirely. When she'd caught sight of it before, she thought it could have been a fox on its hind legs, but now she discounted that idea completely. The shadowy form she'd seen had appeared more human, childlike, and the word primate came to mind. Could something have escaped from a zoo and was now living in the woods? There was a zoo about 40 miles away. She'd seen it on Google Maps. Were monkeys capable of making that kind of journey and then surviving in the wild in the UK climate? She didn't know. Some non-native species like parakeets and the American mink had colonized rural areas. She'd read online. But if something similar had happened here, then surely Chris would have told her when she had mentioned it before. He'd been unfazed and vague and said he couldn't really remember if Camille had said anything about animals visiting the cottage. Perhaps Camille hadn't told him, or perhaps it hadn't happened while she'd been living here. Although, judging from the track marks, they could have been coming into the garden for some time. Or perhaps she was getting all this out of perspective, Jan thought with a sigh. Children or primates living in the wood, whatever next. Yet she'd definitely seen something go over the gate. She snuggled further under her duvet and turned on the television. She couldn't go to bed until Tinder had returned safely from the woods, and she needed to try to think about something else. 15 minutes later, she'd finished the hot toddy and made herself another one. The whiskey had taken effect and she was feeling warmer and braver. As she waited for the kettle to boil, she unlocked the back door, holding it open just wide enough to allow her voice to carry outside. She called, "Tinder! Tinder! Come on, good boy!" She listened, called him again, and then closed and bolted the door. She'd try again later. Taking the hot toddy to the sofa, Jan gazed absently at the television, the sound down while listening for any noise outside. Every so often she checked the time on her phone. 9:30, 10, 10:30, 11 o'clock. Tinder had been missing for over 3 hours, longer than he'd ever been gone before. Had that yelp of pain come from him? She couldn't be sure. Was he lying injured, unable to return? Jan went to the back door and called him again and again, but there was still no sight or sound of him. She didn't have the courage to go out into the woods to search at night. If he didn't return, she'd go as soon as it was light in the morning. One last call, and she returned to sit on the sofa and continued staring, unseeing at the television. More time passed. 11:30. Then it was midnight. Outside, it began to rain. Tinder hated rain. Surely he would come back now if he could. "Tinder!" she cried at the back door, but all she could hear was the steady patter of rain. "Tinder!" She closed the door. Something must have happened for him to be missing this long in the rain. That yelp of pain must have been him. Tinder must be lying injured in the woods at this very moment, dying or even dead. A lump rose in her throat. She'd never forgive herself if something had happened to him. Camille had entrusted her to look after her beloved pet, and Jan had cared for him as if he'd been her own. Yet now, she was too much of a coward to go into the woods and look for him. Suddenly, she started as a knock sounded on the front door. She froze. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The time on her phone showed 00:15. Who the hell was here? Not a visitor, not at this time. Her heart raced as all manner of possibilities charged through her thoughts. Perhaps she should call the police? Or could it have been the wind moving the door knocker? Already unsettled, it was possible that's what she'd heard. She kept very quiet and still, listening for any noise suggesting someone was there. Were they trying to break in? Her stomach churned. Her car was outside, but that wasn't worth much. The only light on was in the living room, and that couldn't be seen from the front. Did they think the cottage was empty? Fear gripped her. The knock came again, more insistent. Then the doorbell rang. A burglar wouldn't ring the doorbell. Or would they? Perhaps it was a ploy so they could burst in when she answered. She should call the police. She picked up her phone. But what was she going to say? Someone was at the front door? Wouldn't they tell her to see who it was? And anyway, by the time they arrived out here, it would probably be too late. Either they would have gone or broken in. An image of being tied up as burglars ransacked the cottage flashed through her mind. The remoteness of the cottage that had attracted her in the first place had turned into a living nightmare. Suddenly Jan's phone buzzed with a text message. Her hand trembled as she looked at the screen. The message was from Chris. "I'm at the front door. Are you in? I've got Tinder. Utter relief. Chris was here with Tinder. She could have cried with joy. Running to the front door, she threw it open and nearly kissed them both. Here you go, Chris said, placing Tinder in her arms. Thank you so much. I've been worried sick. Where on earth did you find him? Come in from the rain. She cuddled and petted Tinder as Chris came in. He was sitting outside the village store in Merryles waiting for it to open, Chris said. It was lucky I spotted him on my way home. Goodness knows what he was doing there. Thank you, she said again, rubbing the top of Tinder's head. I'm so grateful. Chris smiled. You're welcome. I would have kept him overnight and phoned to say he was with me, but you know how he pines if he's away from home. It makes him ill. Yes, Jan said. He's a big softy, aren't you? She tickled Tinder's chin. The reason Camille had wanted someone to rent the cottage who would look after Tinder was because he didn't do well in kennels or being left with someone else, even someone he knew. Would you like a drink? She offered. They were still in the hall. If it's not too late, Chris replied, and took off his wet coat. I walked here. You walked here from the village in the dark and rain? Jan exclaimed. Along Wood Lane? Yes, he laughed, following her into the living room. There's nothing in the woods that can hurt you. It's people who do the harm. There are people in the woods? Jan asked. No, I'm just saying it's people, not the dark, who can do you harm. Are you all right? You seem a bit on edge. I'm okay. I've just been worried about Tinder. Now Chris was here, her previous fears and conjecture had gone, and she was starting to feel safe again. What would you like to drink? She asked, placing Tinder on his rug. Whatever you're having, Chris replied. His gaze went to the bottle of whiskey she'd used for the hot toddies. Whiskey. Anything in it? Just a splash of water, please. As Chris sat in his usual armchair, Jan poured 2 generous whiskies. Ice? She called from the kitchen. No thanks. She added water and carried the glasses into the living room, handing one to Chris and then sat on the sofa. Tinder immediately jumped onto her lap and she began stroking him. You seem quite at home here, Chris remarked, sipping his drink. I suppose I am. How different the cottage felt now she had company. You were out late, she said. I was returning from seeing a friend. Sorry, I didn't mean to pry. It's fine. We're old school friends. We get together every couple of months and sink a few beers. Quite a few, in fact, which is why I didn't take my car. I'm so pleased you found Tinder, Jan said. I'll know next time where to look for him. He's never gone that far before. I guess he chased something into the woods and got lost. He did. But what made you think that? Jan asked. You said before he chased something from the garden. She nodded and took another sip of her drink. Whatever's coming into the garden was here again tonight. I think there could be more than one. Where are they getting in? Through the hole in the hedge at the bottom of the garden, but tonight. She stopped. It seemed ridiculous to try to describe what she'd seen scramble over the side gate. Chris was a regular, down-to-earth type of guy, someone who could happily walk along Wood Lane at night and not get spooked. Yes, he encouraged, looking at her carefully. I'm worried they might get indoors, Jan said. One got very close tonight. And you don't know what they are? She shook her head. Would you like me to board up the hole in the hedge? Chris offered. I'm free tomorrow morning. There's bound to be some wood in the shed here I can use. If not, I'm sure I've got something that will do in my garage. Jan suddenly felt very silly. Of course the obvious solution was to block the hole. And Camille won't mind? She checked. No, why would she? Chris said. Not if it's causing you a problem. He'd clearly forgotten his text telling her she should ask Camille first before she changed anything in the cottage. Jan wasn't going to remind him now. "I'm sure I can do it," she said. "The shed is full of bits of wood." "Okay, but if you want some help, give me a ring." "I will, thanks." Chris emptied his glass. "Would you like a refill?" she offered. "No, I should be going now." He stood, and she saw him to the door, where he unhooked his coat from the hall stand and slipped it on. "Thanks again for finding Tinder. Do you want to take my car to get home?" Jan offered. Better not. A large whiskey on top of all the beer. It would be my luck to be stopped by the police." "There are police in the village?" she asked. "I thought the old police house was empty." She'd seen it when she'd walked through the village exploring. "It's empty, but a patrol car from Coleshaw comes through every so often. You can never be sure when," which Jan found quite reassuring. "Night then," Chris said, opening the door. "Thanks for the drink. Give me a ring if you want any help tomorrow." "I will. Thanks again for returning Tinder." She watched Chris go down the short garden path and then right onto the lane that led to the village. He glanced back and gave a little wave before he disappeared from view. Rather him than me, Jan thought, walking alone at night. And she quickly closed and locked the door. Chapter 10. Emma was worried about whether she was doing the right thing as she let herself into her parents' home while calling, "Mum, it's me." Her father would be out at work. She'd purposely chosen a weekday for that reason. Her mother Mary appeared from the kitchen smiling warmly. "Hello, love. How are you? It's great to see you out and about." She kissed and hugged her daughter. "Tea? Coffee?" "No, thanks." "Come and sit down. Is Ian looking after you?" "Yes, Mum. Very well." "Don't worry. He returned to work today. I need to make the effort to go back too before long." They settled on the sofa in the living room. It was largely unchanged since Emma had left home 5 years ago to marry Ian. She loved returning. It was comforting and reassuring. "You look so much better than the last time I saw you, the day after." Mary began and stopped as her eyes filled. "I'm sorry, love. I'm still struggling to believe it's happened again." "I know, Mum." "Will there be an autopsy to try and find out what went wrong?" Mary asked after a moment. "No." "Isn't it usual when something like this happens?" "It depends. But Ian and I don't want one, and we're not having a funeral either." "Really? I know it's different with early miscarriage, but he would have been a fully formed baby." "Not fully formed," Emma grimaced. "No, sorry, love, bad choice of words, but you know what I mean." Emma did know what her mother meant, and it caused her pain. "Ian and I couldn't cope with a funeral," she said, "so no funeral." "Sometimes it can help give closure, even a small service with just family," Mary persisted. "Mum, please stop," Emma cried. "This is difficult enough as it is. I want to forget and try to move on." "I'm sorry, love. I was just trying to help. I won't mention it again, I promise. But you know you can talk to me any time." Emma nodded. "Now, what was it you wanted to ask me that you couldn't over the phone?" Emma took a breath and chose her words carefully. She was worried her mother wouldn't understand the importance of what she was about to say and would be upset, even angry. She didn't need any more upset in her life right now. "Mum, Ian's doing some research online about our ancestors." "Oh, yeah?" "He's trying to find out if what happened to us has happened before to other family members. He's applying for copies of death certificates. He thinks if it's something that has been passed down, you know, genetic, then it could be treated." "Well, good luck to him," Mary replied. "But Why are you looking so anxious? Because he doesn't know Dad isn't my biological father. And neither must he, ever. No one knows apart from the three of us, and the clinic where we were treated, of course. When I told you, we agreed it would remain our secret. Your father is a proud man, and was mortified he couldn't father a child. He's been good to you, a proper father. He couldn't have loved you any more. I know that, Mum. That's not the point. What is it, then? Mary asked, worried. You haven't told anyone, have you? No, but I think I should tell Ian. Why? Whatever for? Mary exclaimed, the colour draining from her face. Because obviously there's no point in researching Dad's family, as I don't have his genes, she said, slightly frustrated. I realise that, but don't tell Ian, please. It would destroy your father if it got back to him. He's your real father, always has been. All that other man gave was his sperm. Let Ian do his research, but please don't tell him. But supposing there is something in the genes of the donor, my biological father, that's causing our problem. We won't know, so it can't be corrected. Ian and I have decided we won't try again for another child unless we know for certain the same thing can't happen. I was thinking I could trace the donor myself and then tell Ian. There's no chance there could be anything wrong with the donor's genes, Mary said. All donors are thoroughly screened. The clinic explained to us how thorough their screening was. The donor has a detailed medical and lots of tests. They examine their DNA too. I remember the doctor saying only the healthiest sperm donors are selected, so it can't be him. Emma looked at her mother and felt sorry for her. She was so immersed in protecting her father, she couldn't see the logic in what Emma was saying. But this was too important to let go. Ian wonders if it's something in our genes that lies dormant and only appears if two people with the same defective gene have a child. It can't be. The clinic tests for that too. They test for everything, love. Trust me. If there's something wrong, it certainly isn't with the donor. I suppose it could be me, but I've never heard of anything like this happening in my family. My guess is that Ian will find something in his family, if indeed there's anything to be found. Sometimes nature gets it wrong, and it's no one's fault. Ian's checked your family, Emma said. What details were you given of the donor? Everything, except his name and address. The donor's identity was kept secret to protect everyone involved. The law has changed since then, so I could trace him now if I wanted to. Oh, Emma, you wouldn't! It would destroy your father. And it's not fair on the donor either. He made that gift to help childless couples like us, not because he wanted a family of his own. I don't want to be his daughter, Emma cried passionately. I don't even want to meet him. Dad is my father and always will be. I was just thinking of contacting the clinic and asking for details about the donor's genetic history. No, love. Let it go. Don't go looking for trouble. You and Ian have each other. Not everyone is meant to have children. Which was ironic, Emma thought, coming from her mother, who'd gone to such lengths to conceive her. I'll give it some more thought, Emma said. It was the only truthful reassurance she could give her. Chapter 11. DC Beth Mays was driving the unmarked police car on the return journey to Coleshaw Police Station. Her colleague, DC Matt Davis, was in the passenger seat. They'd just come from interviewing Charlie Bates, a member of a local family of hardened criminals. He'd only been released from prison the previous day and was already suspected of taking part in an armed robbery. The car phone rang and Matt answered it. "Have you finished with Mr. Bates?" DS Bert Scrivener asked. "For now," Matt replied. "We're on our way back." Can you take a detour to 55 Booth Lane and visit Mrs. Angela Slater? Beth knows what it's in connection with. I phoned her yesterday, sir, Beth said. I told her the outcome of my visit to Mr. and Mrs. Jennings and that their baby was stillborn. She's not convinced, D.S. Scrivener said. She's phoned twice this morning. She says she has new evidence, but it's too delicate to explain over the phone. She wants to speak to someone involved in the case, to use her words. So that's you, Beth. But there is no case, sir, Beth said. Matt glanced at her, puzzled. The baby was born dead. That's all there is to it. I told Mrs. Slater that. Tell her again, please. Then come back here. Very good, sir, Beth said, and Matt ended the call. What was all that about? He asked as Beth indicated right to make the detour. Mrs. Slater reported that her neighbours Ian and Emma Jennings had a baby, but it disappeared. I interviewed the couple and filed my report. They had a home birth, but sadly the baby was born dead. I can't imagine what new evidence there could be. Perhaps she's claiming they murdered it, Matt suggested. Impossible. There was a midwife present at the birth, and she took the baby's body away. There was nothing suspicious. Mr. and Mrs. Jennings are just an average couple who are struggling to come to terms with their loss. They've probably had enough of Mrs. Slater's prying. So, neighbour dispute then? Matt said. Could be. A few minutes later, Beth parked the car outside the home of Mrs. Slater. Her neighbour's drive was empty, suggesting that Ian and Emma Jennings were out, possibly at work. Hopefully trying to pick up the pieces of their lives, Beth thought. Do you want to wait in the car? I shouldn't be long, Beth asked Matt. It didn't really need two of them to speak to Mrs. Slater. Unlike the notorious Bates family when they always went in pairs. No, I'll come in. I'm intrigued, Matt said, and opened his car door. I wouldn't want you to miss a vital piece of information. Joker, Beth said with a smile. She'd worked with Matt before, and they enjoyed some light-hearted banter. Beth pressed the bell at number 55, and the door was immediately opened. Mrs. Slater, DC's Beth Mays and Matt Davis, Beth said as they showed her their ID cards. We spoke on the phone. Mrs. Slater was in her early 60s, Beth guessed, and smartly dressed. I'm glad they've sent you. I didn't want to go over it all again with someone who didn't know the case. She ushered them into her neat living room, which was at the front of the house. Would you like a drink? No, thank you, Beth said. We're needed back at the station as soon as we've finished here. Sit down, then. It will take a few minutes for me to explain what I've found out. Beth and Matt sat on the sofa as Angela Slater took the slightly higher armchair and looked at them as if addressing an audience. A glass-fronted display cabinet stood against one wall, containing ornaments, family photographs and an empty glass decanter with 6 matching glasses. Matt took out his notepad. I'm convinced my neighbours Ian and Emma are hiding something. Angela Slater began with a sense of intrigue. I don't believe their baby is dead. They haven't arranged a funeral, nor have they registered its death. How do you know that? Beth asked, surprised. Matt's pen hovered above the notebook. I saw Ian going to work yesterday. I asked him when the funeral was so I could attend or at least send some flowers. He said they weren't having a funeral, which I thought was very odd. Perhaps it's family only, Beth suggested. I wondered that and thought maybe they hadn't liked to tell me and hurt my feelings, so I telephoned my friend Nora. She works at Lovell's Funeral Directors in town. She's a good friend and we often have a chat and a laugh about the goings-on behind the scenes at the funeral parlour. You wouldn't believe some of the things she tells me. So much for confidentiality, Beth thought. My friend Nora said Lovell's hasn't been contacted to arrange the funeral of David Jennings. Angela Slater concluded with satisfaction. Perhaps they're using a different funeral director, Beth said, suggesting the obvious. That's what I thought too, Angela said in a conspiratorial tone. But I've checked all the funeral directors within a 20-mile radius, and none of them have been contacted to arrange the funeral. Beth stared at her while Matt remarked dryly, "That shows some dedication." Beth threw him a warning look. They got on well together, but he wasn't renowned for his subtlety. "Not only that," Angela Slater continued, leaning forward slightly, "there isn't a death certificate. I got Nora to check the register of deaths. The baby isn't listed, which it should have been. You have to register a baby's death just like you do an adult's." Beth was momentarily speechless. Not so much because of what Mrs. Slater was saying, but the lengths she'd gone to. "If a baby is stillborn, then it has to be registered on the stillborn registry. But you have 42 days to register." "I know that," Mrs. Slater said impatiently. "But if a baby is born alive and then dies, its death has to be registered within 5 days, as with any other death, even if it only lives for an hour." Beth held Mrs. Slater's gaze. "It was stillborn," Beth said as Matt wrote. "No, it wasn't stillborn. It was alive. I heard it cry." "You didn't mention that before when we spoke," Beth said. "You told me you couldn't see the baby's face because it was covered by a blanket in the Moses basket." "I couldn't see it, but I heard it." "So why didn't you tell me that the last time?" Beth asked. "I didn't think I had to. I just thought you'd assume it was alive. It was only after you said that the Jennings had told you that the baby was dead that I realized the significance of what I'd heard." Beth paused for a moment and looked thoughtful. "When exactly did you hear it cry?" she asked. "As the midwife lifted the Moses basket into her car. I was upstairs looking out of my bedroom window. The fanlight window was open and I heard it cry. A funny little mewing sound." "Could it have been a cat you heard?" Matt asked, which Beth thought was a reasonable question.
"Don't be ridiculous,"
Mrs. Slater exclaimed, glaring at Matt.
"I know the difference between a baby's cry and a cat."
"They can sound similar from a distance," Beth offered.
"I'm telling you, it was a baby I heard," Mrs. Slater said vehemently. "Their child was alive when it left the house."
"So what do you think happened to it?" Matt asked.
"I've no idea. That's for you to find out. I've told you all I know."
"So that's everything?" Beth asked.
"Yes."
"Thank you," Beth said. Matt put away his pencil and notepad.
"Will you go next door now?" Mrs. Slater asked as they all stood. "Emma Jennings is in."
"I'll discuss what our next steps will be with my colleagues," Beth said diplomatically. Mrs. Slater saw them out.
"What do you think?"
Matt asked Beth as they went down the path. The front door had closed behind them. "I think she's mistaken about hearing it cry, and the baby was stillborn." "Or perhaps she did hear it cry, and it died shortly after," Matt suggested. "It's possible, but in that case there should be a death certificate. Mrs. Slater was right when she said a baby's death has to be recorded in the same way as an adult's, even if it only lives for a short while. We'd better speak to Mrs. Jennings." Having reached the end of Angela Slater's driveway, they went right and walked up the drive next door to number 57. Beth rang the bell and they waited. Then she rang it again. A few moments later the door opened on a chain, just enough for Emma Jennings to see out. "Hello, Mrs. Jennings. Detective Constable Beth Mays," she said, showing her ID. "I visited you before when your husband was here. This is my colleague, Detective Constable Matt Davis." "Yes. What do you want?" "Could we come in?" Beth asked. "Why?" "Ian isn't here. He's at work." "We don't need to speak to him. I'm sure you'll be able to help us. It won't take long." Emma hesitated, and then removed the chain to let them in. "I'm sorry for your loss," Matt said as they entered. "Thank you," Emma said. Beth thought Emma looked significantly better than the last time she'd seen her, when she'd been in bed and was being looked after by her husband, but she still had a way to go and seemed fragile. "Shall we sit down?" Beth suggested. Emma led the way into the front room. "We won't keep you long," Beth said. "We've been contacted by a worried neighbour." "I can guess who that is," Emma said dourly. We made the mistake of being friendly with Mrs. Slater when we first moved in. Now she won't leave us alone." Beth nodded. "I know this may sound insensitive, but I need to ask you a difficult question in connection with your baby." "What?" Emma asked anxiously. There was no easy way to put it. "Was your baby born alive, and then died, or was it stillborn?" Beth said. "Why would you want to know that?" Emma cried, immediately distressed. "It appears there's no record of the death yet." "I don't know about that. It's nothing to do with me. The midwife was seeing to it all." "The problem is, you only have 5 days to register a death," Beth said. "And that time is gone." Emma looked at her confused. "If a baby is stillborn, you have longer, 42 days, but it still has to be registered." "I suppose it was stillborn then," Emma said, her eyes filling. "I'm sorry," Beth said. "Don't you know?" she asked gently. "No, I was in such a bad way. I couldn't bear to see it. He was born very early, premature, and wasn't right. We haven't talked about it since." "So you didn't see or hold your baby before the midwife took him away?" Beth asked in the same sensitive tone. She knew parents could spend some time with their dead baby if they wished. Emma's reaction wasn't what she expected. "No, of course not. What a dreadful idea. I just wanted him out of here and gone. He wasn't right. Ian didn't see or touch him either. The midwife took him and then came back to see me." "I see. Thank you," Beth said, as Matt wrote. "Are you planning on having a funeral?" "No. My mother asked me that, but I don't understand why you want to know. It's private." "I'm sorry," Beth said. "I'm just trying to establish a timeline. There is some suggestion that the baby may have been alive when he left here."
"That's ridiculous. Of course he wasn't. Can you go now, please?"
"Yes, I'm sorry I've upset you. I don't need to bother you any further. Your midwife will be able to give me the details. What's her name?" "I don't know," Emma replied agitatedly. "Her name will be on your maternity records?" Beth prompted. Emma didn't reply. "I won't trouble you further," Beth said, standing. "I can get the information from your health service provider. They'll have her details." "It's Anne Long," Emma suddenly said. "Now I want you to go. I'm not feeling well. I need to lie down." "I'm sorry. Can I call someone to be with you, your husband?"
"No, just go."
Emma remained in the living room as Beth and Matt let themselves out. "What do you make of that?" Matt asked once in the car. "Not sure. I need to speak to the midwife."